Over 400 years, 12.5 million African men, women, and children were kidnapped from their homes and forced across the Atlantic. This map illustrates the largest forced migration in human history. Every line represents voyages carrying captured people far from everything they knew. To understand how this system started, we have to look at the colonization of the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries. European empires realized they could extract immense wealth from the soil by growing cash crops like sugar and tobacco. But these colonizers faced a massive labor shortage. The extreme violence they brought, combined with imported diseases, caused a devastating demographic collapse among the indigenous populations. To mine the gold and harvest the sugar, these empires needed massive amounts of new workers. They built an economic system reliant on extracting labor from people they could treat as expendable. This demand created the triangular trade. It was a massive economic network connecting 3 continents across 3 distinct oceanic routes. The first leg started here, in European ports like Liverpool. Ships left these docks loaded with textiles, manufactured goods, and crucially, firearms. They sailed south to the coast of West Africa. European powers built massive coastal fortifications on the shoreline to secure their physical presence. At these outposts, merchants traded their manufactured goods for human beings, integrating the histories of Africa, Europe, and the Americas into a single, complex commercial highway. On the beaches of West Africa, European traders brokered deals with local leaders. They unloaded their cargo of iron, cloth, and weapons in exchange for captive Africans. The influx of European firearms meant that for many African kingdoms, having the most weapons became the only way to avoid becoming the next victims of the trade. Armed groups had a sudden military advantage. To defend themselves or expand their territory, communities needed guns, and the only way to buy those guns was to capture rivals and sell them to the Europeans. European demand engineered a state of perpetual warfare. It guaranteed a steady, desperate supply of human captives, as communities were forced to participate in the trade just to survive. Once sold, captives were forced onto ships for the Middle Passage, the second leg of the triangle, and a weeks-long nightmare across the ocean. This diagram shows the lower deck of the British slave ship Brooks. Captives were packed so tightly they were treated purely as cargo. Below deck, people were chained together, separated from their families, and forced to endure disease-ridden holds, paralyzed by fear. We know these details from survivors like Olata Equiano, kidnapped at age 11. His first-hand accounts document the psychological trauma and physical horrors of the crossing. The calculus of the Middle Passage was incredibly brutal. Of the 12.5 million people forced onto these ships, nearly 2 million died at sea. Looking at this breakdown of the 10.7 million survivors, you can see where they ended up. The vast majority were sent to sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. The enslaved labor produced massive quantities of raw materials: sugar, rum, tobacco, and cotton. Ships in the Americas loaded up these lucrative goods and sailed back across the Atlantic to European ports, completing the cycle. This capital provided the funding for major industries and institutions in North America and Europe that still exist today, directly supporting the development of global economic growth. The global dominance of Europe and the United States did not happen in a vacuum. It was subsidized by centuries of stolen African labor. Because European empires were now dependent on a labor system based on kidnapping and extreme violence, they faced a contradiction with their own legal and religious values. To maintain this system, they developed an ideology to justify treating human beings as property, the legal and social invention of a racial caste system that positioned African people as inherently inferior. In the 19th century, abolitionist movements gained traction and eventually forced an end to the legal slave trade. But the transatlantic slave trade is not just a dark chapter of the past. It hollowed out a continent, built the generational wealth of the West, and established a legacy of systemic racism that continues to shape our institutions today.